study of the book of Daniel. Daniel, in many ways, is actually two books. The first half of Daniel for 6 chapters is more of a personal story, an inspiring story about the courage and faithfulness of a young teenage boy. Second half of Daniel is profound prophecy. That's its concentration. So we have 2 distinct books, all with one purpose: encouragement. The entire book of Daniel is a testimony that God honors his promises. Daniel, at a very early age, had learned 3 timeless words that will serve him well. I trust you. In Isaiah 12:2, I trust you to save me, Lord God, and I won't be afraid. Daniel trusted God and did not allow his circumstances to undermine that trust. Biblical prophecy is one of the ways that God validates his promises to us. Scholars estimate that 80% of biblical prophecy has already been fulfilled, just as God said it would be. We can be encouraged that the final 20% that's acting out as we speak will unfold exactly as he promised. Let's take a brief outline look at the book of Daniel. The first 6 chapters record Daniel's life in exile in Babylon and include 2 prophetic visions of this Babylonian king named Nebuchadnezzar. The time period would be around 604, 605 BC is the beginning of chapter 1, verse 1. Then in the second half of the book, the last 6 chapters will focus on Daniel's prophetic visions that foretell the emergence of these Gentile powers that will rule over the nation of Israel, and most of all, the coming of Christ, the Messiah. The first verse of Daniel would open in the city of Jerusalem, and then the southern kingdom of Judah. These are dark times for the people of Israel, the Jewish people. Their leadership has all but abandoned all trust in God's guidance. At the time, you recall, of King David and his son King Solomon, they had been a powerful, strong, prosperous, united nation under God. But that was 300 years earlier. They have now, or at this point, had become a divided nation and had been warring internally with each other. They had split into the northern kingdom of Israel, here in green, with its capital in Samaria. The northern kingdom was mostly made up of the original 10 of the 12 tribes. Then in the south, here in orange, was the kingdom of Judah, with, of course, its capital in Jerusalem. The southern kingdom was made up of the final 2 tribes of Benjamin and Judah. Judah, of course, was the line of David. Unfortunately, the northern kingdom had experienced a long series since Solomon of wicked and prideful kings. Several had become kings by assassinating their predecessors. These kings included men like Ahab and his queen, Jezebel. King Ahab, you might recall, is the one that built temples in Samaria to Baal, the sun god. And he even erected worship poles for Baal's wife, Asherah, the moon goddess. Basically, these were gods to wealth and to sex. Each of these kings had rejected the prophets that God had consistently sent to them, like Isaiah. As a result, the northern kingdom was growing weak and decaying from the inside out. At the same time, their northern enemy, the Assyrians, were getting stronger. Around 730 BC, the Assyrian army came south, and they conquered the northern kingdom and began to force the people into exile. That's the purple line. And then over several years, as the prophets had warned, they were taken into captivity and scattered throughout the Assyrian northern territories near their capital city here in Nineveh. Nineveh was the major city located on the Tigris River. Because they were scattered and not settled as one unit, they became known as the lost 10 tribes of Israel. At that time, the Assyrians also ruled over all of Babylon to the south. And from all those regions, you see the orange line, they repopulated the northern kingdom over several years with Gentiles throughout that area in Samaria. And during this time, the mighty Assyrian army also tried to take the southern kingdom of Judah, especially the prized city of Jerusalem. But Judah was saved. It would not be taken into captivity until Daniel, to the time of Daniel around 600 BC. Because when they attacked in 730 BC, the king of Judah was a righteous king called Hezekiah. He prayed that Jerusalem would be protected. And here we see Hezekiah trusted in the Lord of Israel. There was no one like him among all the kings of Judah. Either before or after his time, he remained faithful to the Lord. Hezekiah trusted in God. As a result of his faithfulness, that trust, Jerusalem was saved miraculously from a much more powerful Assyrian army in 730 BC. But when we open up the book of Daniel in verse 1, we're going to find that there's been a whole string of not so good kings. In fact, the king at that point, let's say in 2 Kings 23:37, he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. That rather than trusting in God, he had turned Judah over to the basically Egyptians as a vassal state for protection from the Assyrians. Judah had become this pawn between the powerful Assyrians and the rising Babylonians to the north and the powerful Egyptians to the south. God had sent several prophets, including Jeremiah, to warn the king and the people of Judah against this alliance. In fact, in Jeremiah 26:3, he employed the people. He says, listen and trust God and to turn away from their evil ways. But the king and the people had rejected these warnings. God had sent a second prophet, Uriah, with the same message, and the king had him executed. So this is how we open the state of affairs in Jerusalem in the southern kingdom as we open the book of Daniel in verse 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hands, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God. Daniel tells us that the king was in his 3rd year, Jehoiakim, which means we're around 605 BC. We also know from history that the Babylonians at this point were clearly the most powerful empire in that entire region. Here we have a map of the Babylonian Empire, which lasted about 80 years. In 612 BC, 7 years from his attack on the southern kingdom, Nebuchadnezzar successfully defeated the major portion of the Assyrian army and already taken control at this point of their capital city, Nineveh. They also had control of the area north of the northern kingdom of Israel. So they had what was control of what was called then the Fertile Crescent, which is the prized fertile land around the river regions that border the Arabian desert, the Syrian desert. So from Jerusalem, he had control of the Jordan River to the west. And then the north, he had control of Nineveh, which is the Tigris River. And then in Babylon, of course, he had control of the Euphrates in the south. We also know in that same year that he attacked the southern kingdom in 605 BC, he successfully had a major battle in the north, a final battle against the Assyrians and their ally, which was the Egyptians, under Pharaoh Necho, who had come north to challenge the Babylonians. Here we see a battle plan. The battle took place there on the west bank of the Euphrates in what would be not modern-day Turkey and the Syrian border, marked here in red. So we have King Nebuchadnezzar chased the Egyptian Pharaoh's army all the way south. And so what happened at the end of 605, as we see in verse 1 in Daniel, he stopped at the northern kingdom and he besieged this Egyptian vassal state, the kingdom of Judah. This word besiege means to enclose or to encircle, surround, which likely means that he didn't attack, but just used his massive army to encircle the city. And unlike King Hezekiah, the great-grandfather of the current Judah king, he did not turn to God. And, of course, Hezekiah's God fought off those Assyrians. In this case, he capitulated. He literally handed the keys over to Nebuchadnezzar in order to save his job. And he agreed to, quote, switch sides and be a vassal of Babylon versus a vassal of the Egyptians. So Nebuchadnezzar in 605 did not level Jerusalem. That happens 3 years later. Instead, Nebuchadnezzar required the king to give him a major heavy tax payment. And he agreed that this weak Judean king could stay in power, stay in place, as long as he was under the thumb of Nebuchadnezzar. And so Judah became a buffer state between the powerful Babylonians to the north and the Egyptians to the south. And we'll see that the king of Judah reneges on that promise 3 years later. He's going to switch back, or try to switch back, to the Egyptians. Let's take a look at 2 Kings. During Jehoiakim's reign, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, invaded the land, and Jehoiakim became a vassal for 3 years. Judah, king of Judah, would turn his back on the Babylonians, and rather than putting his trust in God, will put his trust in the Egyptians, unfortunately. As a result, Nebuchadnezzar will return, as was prophesied, kill the king of Judah, and level the city and level the temple. And that's when the people of Judah will be taken into captivity through that northern route back to Babylon and be there for 70 years. Let's go back to verse 1 and 2. Notice the verse says that Nebuchadnezzar carried off some of the articles from the Jerusalem temple. And what did he do with them? He placed them, quote, in his God's temple in Babylon. The Hebrew word here for articles could be translated vessels or artifacts. Doesn't necessarily mean valuables. It means, quote unquote, the goods that are located within the temple. Why would Nebuchadnezzar take these type of things from the temple? He's sending a message to the world that his God is stronger than the God of Judah. The king's making a statement that your king, your city, your people, and even your God are under my authority and under my gods in Babylon. But notice in verse 2, it says, and the Lord delivered, and the Lord delivered. The author of this book, of course, is Daniel. He wants to remind us, encourage us, even in the midst of all this chaos and tragedy, God remains in charge. God is only allowing the Babylonians to be an instrument to humble the unrepentant kingdom of Judah. Just as Jeremiah and Uriah had warned them that they needed to change, or there's going to be consequences to their sin. God had warned them through Isaiah 39, verses 6 and 7. The time is coming when everything in your palace, he told the king, all the treasures stored up by your ancestors until now, will be carried off to Babylon. Again, this is 100 years earlier. Nothing will be left, says the Lord. Some of your very own sons, including Daniel, will be taken away into exile. They will become eunuchs And that doesn't necessarily mean castration. The Hebrew word there means to be a court administrator or an officer who will serve in the palace of the Babylonian kings. And then we find in Jeremiah, in chapter 1 and 25, this whole land, he's talking about the kingdoms of the north and the south, of Israel and Judea, will become desolate wastelands because everybody's going to be exiled. And these nations will serve the king of Babylon for 70 years. Specifically, Jeremiah tells them 70 years. But when 70 years are complete, I will punish the king of Babylon, which we shall see. Then in Jeremiah 50 chapter, Babylon will fall. Her images and idols will be shattered. Her god Baal and Marduk will be utterly disgraced. For a nation will attack her from the north, meaning the Persians and the Medes, and bring her such destruction that no one will live there again. Daniel had the benefit of these prophets. He knew that God had not abandoned the Jewish people, but they were experiencing the consequences of their own decisions. They had rejected God and rejected God's guidance and his word and his messengers, the prophets. The attitude of the people of Judea can best be described in 2 Chronicles. Let's take a look at that. Again and again the Lord, the God of their fathers, sent word to his people through his messengers, through his prophets, because he had compassion. He loved the people of Israel. He had compassion on them and on his dwelling place, meaning the temple. They continually mocked the messengers of God, despised his words, and scoffed at his prophets. Perhaps sounds a bit like America today. That's why the book of Daniel still is such a rich, important, relevant book. A book of encouragement. A book that teaches us even when we sin, and sin takes us in exile to a dark place, God does not abandon us. When you and I call out to him, he offers mercy, forgiveness, and restoration. This is exactly what he promised the people of Israel. That when they were in exile, he sent again a prophet, the prophet Ezekiel. Let's look at what Ezekiel told the people of Israel in exile about God's promise. Thus says the Lord, I will gather you from the peoples and assemble you out of the countries where you have been scattered, and I will give you back the land of Israel. And as we shall see, God honored that promise. Exactly 70 years, the people returned to the promised land of Israel. Let's take now a look at Daniel verses 3 and 4. Then the king, meaning Nebuchadnezzar, ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family, meaning the family of Judah, and the nobility. Young men without any physical defects, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualities to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them, here we go, the language and the literature of the Babylonians. So the king not only took a huge ransom and articles from the temple, he also took something very precious, some of their best and brightest, just as was prophesied. Nebuchadnezzar understood that it takes more than money to run a huge empire. He needed human capital and wisdom to run a civil government within his territories. So he recruited talent for his management team. This practice also likely served as a deterrent to the royal family members that he held their children, some of their children, in captivity. So young men probably means teenagers. These kids, imagine just walking in their sandals. These kids had just seen their entire country being to bow down and being overpowered by this mighty foreigner. They're going to be shipped off to this faraway country and culture with no hope of escape. They're going to have to travel that journey all the way around the desert, which is over 1,000 miles, to get to Babylon, this magnificent, huge city compared to the country place where they are. What is going to happen to them? They are to get a scholarship. They're going to be taught the language and the culture and the literature of the Babylonians. So it's going to be more than just an education. It's going to be a complete indoctrination, a reprogramming of these kids in a Babylonian worldview. Their training would cover a wide range of topics, subjects: astronomy, mathematics, medicine, the world's religions. The king's purpose was to find and develop the best talent that he had within all of his territories as wise men, magi, advisors. They were to become the civil servants, much like we do. The modern day president would have a staff of advisors, economic advisors. These would be the advisors to the king. So their training would include the most modern forecasting tools. What are those? Interpretation of dreams, casting lots, incantations, thank you, astrology. And they would learn the skill. The Babylonians had this perfected skill of interpreting the entrails, the intestines of animals that had been sacrificed, predict the future. We learned about that in the second book in the book of Exodus. Let's take a look at that. For the king of Babylon will stop in the fork of the road, at a junction of the two roads, to do what? To seek an omen. In other words, try to figure out which way to go. He will cast lots with arrows. He will consult his idols. He will examine the entrails, the guts, the liver of dead sacrificed animals in order to determine wisdom of which way to turn. So anyone that could accurately predict the future and interpret dreams, they were someone that was highly prized. That's what Nebuchadnezzar was after, to find folks who would quote that talent. Let's take a look at verse 5. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine. From where? The king's own table. They were to be trained for 3 years. And after that, they were to enter the king's service. So their university education was to include both room and board. Food, that was the best that the kingdom had to offer. These kids were being shipped off to the Harvard University of the day with a full scholarship and even a job offer, a great job offer at the end of their training. Imagine, it must have been somewhat enticing for these young men to compromise and to embrace this new life in this huge worldly city. Let's take a look at verses 6 and 7. Among those who were chosen, meaning from all the territories that Nebuchadnezzar had conquered, were some from Judah. Daniel, whose name means God is my judge. Hananiah, whose name means God is gracious. Mishael, which means God is my example. And Azariah, meaning God is my support. It's interesting that all 4 of these boys had grown up in Judea during the reign of one of the, quote, good kings, the King Josiah. And that's where they gotten their, quote, strong education during that reign in that court. And they received these godly names. But the Babylonians were not going to allow these 4 kids to walk around in the court being called by this Jewish God. So they will have all their names changed. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belshazzar. To Hananiah, Shadrach. To Mishael, Meshach. And Azariah, Abednego. Each of these names were related to a specific Babylonian god. They were expected to abandon their old names, their old culture, and their old God. They were to forget the old ways and fully embrace, to accept the teachings of their learned teachers, professors. Daniel and his companions will have to make some very difficult decisions. But we shall see in next week, in verse 8, Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself. Why? Because he trusted God. I trust you. We'll pick it up there next week. Until then, may God bless you, and may you have a beginning of a bright and healthy 2021. Aloha.